He broke her hand, then called her clumsy. In a crowded diner on a busy Texas morning, a young waitress struggled to balance trays with a bandaged wrist while the man who hurt her laughed in her face. Customers watched in silence as her manager tore into her, blaming her for mistakes that weren't her own. But what he didn't know was that someone else was watching too, a quiet man in the corner booth who was far more than he seemed. What happens when the truth finally comes to light? Will power and cruelty win, or will justice take its turn? Tell us what you think, and if stories like this move you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support is what keeps us bringing you these real stories. The morning rush at Carter's Diner was relentless. Plates clattered, orders piled up, and steam curled from the griddle as Rachel Carter weaved between tables with her good hand gripping a wobbling tray. Her right wrist was bound tight in white bandages, every step forcing her to bite back the sting of pain. "Move faster," barked Frank Dorsey, the manager, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. Conversations hushed. A few customers glanced at Rachel with pity, others with judgment. She ducked her head, whispering, "Sorry, I'm trying." Her voice barely rose above the hum of coffee machines. Then it happened. Her tray tipped. A glass of water slid, and with a sharp splash, the liquid poured across Frank's shirt. He froze, the wet fabric clinging to him, before leaning close with a sneer. "Pathetic," he hissed. Rachel's face flushed crimson as she scrambled to grab napkins, hands shaking. The room fell silent, a tension so thick it pressed on her chest. In the far corner, the man in the booth didn't flinch. He simply watched, eyes steady, unreadable, as if measuring every word, every movement. Rachel swallowed hard, forcing herself to keep moving, knowing she couldn't afford the stop. Not with rent overdue, not with Frank standing there like a shadow she couldn't escape. She pushed through, tray rattling again, pretending she didn't hear the whispered laughter that followed her path. And still, the man in the corner kept watching. That night, long after the last customer left and the neon sign buzzed faintly against the dark Texas sky, Rachel stayed behind to wipe down the counters. The diner was quiet, only the hum of the refrigerators breaking the silence. She stacked chairs, gathered silverware, and tried to shake off the sting of Frank's words from earlier. But then, voices, low, gruff laughter echoing from the back hallway. She paused, cloth in hand, her heart tightening. She knew that laugh. Frank's voice carried, brash and careless. "$6 grand this week, clean as a whistle. And guess who they'll blame if they find out? That little waitress who can't even hold a tray." His buddy snorted, the sound of a beer can cracking open. Rachel's pulse raced. She moved closer, footsteps soft, pressing herself against the wall. The words hit her like bricks. He wasn't just cruel, he was stealing, and he was setting her up to take the fall. She turned to slip away, but the floor creaked beneath her shoe. "Who's there?" Frank's voice snapped, sharp as a whip. Before she could run, his shadow filled the hallway. He stepped into the dim light, his smirk curling. "Well, well," he muttered, blocking her path. Rachel stammered, I was just cleaning." But Frank's hand shot out, seizing her wrist. Pain seared through her arm as he twisted. She gasped. The sound caught in her throat, a muffled cry swallowed by the empty diner. "You ever think about crossing me?" Frank growled, his face inches from hers. "This is what happens." There was a sickening crack. Her knees buckled, and tears blurred her vision. Rachel tried to pull away, but his grip was iron. He leaned closer, voice low and venomous. "One word about what you heard, and you're done. No job, no paycheck. You'll be out on the street before sunrise." Her breath came in shallow bursts, the pain radiating from her wrist to her chest. She nodded, not because she agreed, but because she had no choice.
When he finally released her, she crumpled against the wall, clutching her wrist, the skin already swelling. Frank adjusted his shirt, his tone casual now, like nothing had happened. "Good girl, keep your mouth shut." Then he turned, whistling as he disappeared back into the office. Rachel sat there in the dim glow, the diner smelling of grease and coffee, her body trembling. She bit her lip hard enough to taste blood, forcing the sob back down. She couldn't let him see her break. She pressed her injured wrist against her chest, eyes fixed on the door. The same door that now felt like a prison, locking her into silence. And so she rose, slowly, gripping the counter for support. She blew out the candles on the tables, one by one, her bandaged hand shaking. No one else saw, no one else knew. Only the walls carried the secret of that night. And they weren't talking.
The next morning, the diner was already buzzing when Thomas Reed slid into his usual corner booth. To everyone else, he was just another regular, quiet, unassuming, the kind of man who kept to himself over a black coffee and a newspaper. But behind those steady eyes, he saw everything. Rachel moved through the crowd with her bandaged wrist tucked close, balancing mugs with the other hand. Every step betrayed the pain she tried so hard to hide. Frank lounged near the counter, laughing too loudly at a joke a customer told, his smile wide and harmless to anyone who didn't know better. But Thomas noticed the way his smile tightened only when Rachel came near. He leaned over her shoulder, barking orders meant to humiliate, not to help. When Rachel asked another waitress for a hand lifting a heavy crate of milk, Frank cut in first. "Come on, sweetheart, it's not rocket science. Use both hands. Oh, wait, guess you can't." His chuckle was sharp enough to make the young cook flinch. Rachel forced a small nod, whispering, "Yes, sir," and bent down to try anyway, her face pale with effort. The glass bottles rattled as she staggered toward the fridge. From the corner, Thomas set his cup down slowly. His jaw tightened, but his expression remained unreadable. He had seen enough managers in his life to know the difference between authority and cruelty. Here, cruelty was written in every glance, every word Frank spat at the girl. Rachel pushed through the pain, setting the crate down with a dull thud, her chest heaving. A few customers turned back to their pancakes, unwilling to get involved. Frank smirked, patting her shoulder in mock encouragement, the gesture as cold as the air seeping from the freezer behind them. Thomas didn't move. Not yet. He simply observed, eyes following every detail, storing each small cruelty like pieces of a puzzle. His hand rested flat against the table, fingers drumming once, slow and deliberate. It wasn't anger that filled him. It was certainty. And as Frank barked again, calling Rachel dead weight loud enough for the whole diner to hear, Thomas leaned back in his booth, the shadow of a plan already forming in his mind. Thomas didn't wait long to make his move. Later that morning, as the crowd thinned and the clatter of plates softened, he rose from his booth and walked toward the counter. Rachel had slipped into the back to catch her breath, leaving Frank alone, leaning lazily against the register with a smug look plastered on his face. "Morning," Thomas said evenly, resting his hands on the counter. His voice was calm, almost casual, but his gaze was sharp. "Tell me something. Why is that young woman out there working with her wrist wrapped up like that?" Frank straightened, caught off guard for a moment, before flashing a quick smile. "Oh, Rachel? She's careless. Clumsy as they come. Couldn't even handle carrying trays without hurting herself. I'm doing her a favor keeping her on the schedule. Most places would have cut her loose." He chuckled under his breath, as if the thought amused him. Thomas didn't return the smile. He let the silence stretch, eyes locked on Frank, until the man shifted uncomfortably. Then Thomas said, almost too softly, "That's not how it looked from where I was sitting." Frank's grin faltered. "Look, she's lucky to have a job here. I keep this place running. People like her, they don't last if I don't make allowances." His tone turned defensive, his words stumbling slightly as he spoke. Thomas leaned in just a fraction. "Allowances," he repeated, the word rolling off his tongue with quiet disbelief. He let the word hang there, studying Frank's face, every twitch and flicker betraying more than the man realized. For the first time, Frank broke eye contact. He busied himself shuffling receipts, muttering, "You don't know the half of it. You think she's some innocent? She's trouble, always has been." Thomas nodded slowly, as though satisfied, but inside his suspicion hardened. The version Frank spun didn't line up with the bruises he'd seen, the winces Rachel tried to hide. He stepped back, his voice steady. "Interesting perspective," he said simply, then turned and walked back to his booth. From across the diner, Rachel emerged again, clutching a pot of coffee, her eyes darting briefly toward Thomas. He gave nothing away, only lifted his cup slightly as she passed, his mind already fitting Frank's lies into place with everything else he'd seen. That afternoon, when the diner hit its quiet stretch between the breakfast crowd and the lunch rush, Thomas rose from his booth. He moved with purpose, his footsteps steady as he slipped past the kitchen and toward the narrow hallway that led to the manager's office. The door was closed, a crooked sign reading "Staff Only" dangling from one nail. He glanced over his shoulder once, then turned the knob. It clicked open with little resistance. Inside, the office smelled of stale coffee and cheap cologne. Papers littered the desk in messy stacks, a half-empty bottle of aspirin tipped over near the phone. Thomas scanned quickly, his eyes narrowing when he spotted a folder shoved halfway beneath a ledger. He pulled it free, flipping it open. Page after page, write-ups with Rachel's name scrawled across the top. Lateness, carelessness, accidents. Too many to be coincidence. He set them aside, opening the ledger. Numbers marched across the page, but the math didn't add up. Cash tallies were short by hundreds, sometimes thousands, each shortage tucked neatly into columns that should have balanced. Thomas reached for a small notebook from his jacket pocket, scribbling down dates, figures, and totals. His hand moved with practiced ease, every detail carefully recorded. A noise from the hallway froze him in place. Footsteps, heavy and slow, echoing closer. Thomas slid the papers back into place, shutting the folder with a soft thud. The doorknob rattled. Without hesitation, he crouched low, slipping into the shadow beside the file cabinet. The door creaked open, and Frank's voice drifted in. "Figures," he muttered, tossing something onto the desk. "She'll take the blame for this, like always." His laughter was quiet, smug. Thomas held his breath, muscles coiled, watching from the darkness as Frank shuffled through the mess, oblivious. After a moment, Frank grabbed his keys and left again, the door slamming behind him. Only then did Thomas rise, his jaw set tight. He slipped out of the office as quietly as he had entered, returning to his booth just as Rachel passed by with another tray. To anyone watching, he was just another diner patron finishing his coffee. But his eyes told a different story. Behind them burned certainty. Frank Dorsey wasn't just cruel, he was dirty. And soon, there would be no hiding it. That night, long after the lights in the diner's front windows dimmed, Thomas returned. He parked his truck down the block, the engine cutting into silence. The building loomed under the glow of a single flickering street lamp, and through the half-drawn blinds he could see the faint orange light still burning in the office. He waited, hands steady on the steering wheel, until the sound of laughter carried out into the night. It was Frank's voice, loud, slurred, bragging. Thomas slipped out of the truck, boots crunching against gravel, and moved closer. The back door stood ajar, a wedge of light spilling into the alley. He stepped inside, careful to hug the shadows, and the voices grew clearer. "$6 grand this week, easy," Frank boasted. "And not a soul's the wiser. That little waitress, perfect scapegoat. Everyone already thinks she's clumsy. Break a few glasses, spill some water, it's all on her." His buddy laughed, the clink of beer bottles ringing through the office. Thomas froze, jaw tightening. He edged closer until he could see through the cracked door. Frank leaned back in his chair, legs kicked up on the desk, his words dripping with arrogance. She tried to snoop once, had to set her straight. One twist to the wrist, and she won't be trying that again. He mimicked the motion with his hand, twisting the air, grinning as his friend howled with laughter. The sound made Thomas's stomach knot. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. Every instinct screamed to storm in, but he held back, his mind colder than the rage building in his chest. He pulled his phone from his jacket, thumb pressing record, capturing every vile word as Frank continued to brag. "Best part," Frank slurred, "if the owner ever shows his face, I'll feed him the same lies. He'll never know. He trusts me." He laughed again, high and ugly. He ended the recording, sliding the phone back into his jacket. He stepped quietly into the alley once more, the night air cutting against his face. His decision was set. Tomorrow, the charade would end. No more watching from the corner booth, no more giving Frank rope to tighten around someone else's neck. As he walked back to his truck, the faint sound of Rachel's voice earlier that day echoed in his mind, trembling but unbroken. He gripped the steering wheel hard, eyes fixed ahead. Justice wasn't coming later. Justice was coming now. The sun had barely risen when Thomas Reed returned to the diner, but this time he didn't slip quietly into the corner booth. His shoulders were squared, his step firm, and there was a gravity in his eyes that made heads turn the moment he walked through the door. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the air as the morning crowd gathered, unaware of what was about to unfold. Rachel moved carefully between tables, her wrist still wrapped tight, exhaustion etched into her face. Frank stood near the register, already barking orders, already smirking at her pain. When he saw Thomas enter, he flashed the same hollow grin. "Well, look who's back. Usual coffee? Corner booth?" Thomas didn't answer. He kept walking until he stood in the center of the diner, his presence commanding the room. The clatter of forks and spoons quieted. Conversations trailed off. The sudden hush spread like a wave until even Rachel froze mid-step, a tray balanced in her trembling hand. "No," Thomas said, his voice calm but carrying. "Not today." Frank blinked, his grin faltering. "Excuse me?" Thomas's gaze didn't waver. "You heard me. Things are going to be different today." The room stilled. Customers shifted in their seats, sensing the shift in the air. Rachel's eyes darted between the two men, confusion flickering across her face. Frank gave a nervous chuckle, scratching the back of his neck. "Hey, relax. No need to make a scene. We run a respectable place here." But Thomas stepped closer, his boots echoing on the tile. "Respectable," he repeated, the word sharp as glass. He leaned just enough to let Frank feel the weight of his stare. "Tell me, Frank, what exactly do you think respectable looks like?" Frank swallowed, his eyes flicking toward the office, then back to Thomas. For the first time, the confidence drained from his posture. The walls of the diner seemed to press in tighter, every gaze now fixed on him. Rachel's chest rose and fell, her breath shallow as she clutched the tray tighter. She didn't understand yet, but something inside her whispered that everything she had endured was about to shift. And Thomas, standing tall in the middle of his own diner, knew the time for shadows had ended. Today, the truth would step into the light.
A spoon tapped against a glass, once, twice, the sharp sound cutting through the hush like a bell. Every head turned. Thomas Reed stood tall in the center of the diner, his voice calm but steady, carrying into every corner. "My name," he said, "is Thomas Reed, and I am the owner of this diner." The room erupted in murmurs. Forks clinked against plates. Whispers surged like a current. Rachel's eyes widened, Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Frank's grin collapsed into a grimace, his face paling. "Owner?" he stammered, forcing out a shaky laugh. That's a good one." Thomas reached into his coat and laid a neat stack of papers on the counter. Receipts, logs, records scrawled with missing sums. One by one, he spread them out like cards on a table. "These," he said firmly, "are the numbers that don't add up. Thousands of dollars gone." He turned, locking eyes with the crowd, and every false write-up pinned on Rachel Carter to cover it. Gasps rippled across the diner. A woman at the window shook her head. A man near the door muttered, "Unbelievable." Frank lunged forward, snatching at the papers. "These don't prove anything," he snapped. But Thomas didn't flinch. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He pressed a button, and the sound filled the room. Frank's own voice spilled into the silence, smug and unfiltered. $6,000 this week easy. That little waitress, perfect scapegoat. One twist of the wrist, and she won't try again. The color drained from Frank's face. The diner froze, the confession echoing louder than any shout. Rachel's tray slipped from her hands and landed softly on the booth beside her, her body trembling. Her lips trembled, but this time it wasn't fear. It was shock, and something else rising beneath it. Thomas turned back to Frank, eyes steady. "You thought no one was watching. You thought you could steal, break, and lie your way through. But your words condemn you." Frank stumbled back a step, his confidence shattered, sweat glistening on his brow. Customers leaned forward, every eye piercing him like a jury. Rachel pressed her bandaged wrist against her chest, her breath catching as the truth unfolded at last. The silence that followed was heavy, charged, the air waiting for what would come next.
The diner door swung open with a rush of cold morning air, and two uniformed officers stepped inside. Their boots clicked against the tile as the crowd instinctively parted, creating a clear path to the counter where Frank stood frozen. His face was pale, his lips trembling, but his eyes darted wildly, searching for an escape. Thomas didn't move. He simply lifted a hand and pointed. "That's the man. He's been stealing from this place and assaulting my staff. You all heard the proof." His voice carried like a gavel striking wood. The officers exchanged a look, then advanced. "Frank Dorsey?" one asked, firmly. Frank raised his hands halfway, sputtering, "Wait, this is a mistake. He's twisting the story. I've been running this diner, keeping it afloat while he's been gone. I did everything for this place." His words spilled out in panic, but no one in the room looked convinced. Rachel stood near the booths, clutching her bandaged wrist, her eyes wide and glassy with tears. She could hardly breathe as the officers turned him around and snapped cold steel around his wrists. The click of the handcuffs rang out, final and undeniable. Gasps filled the air, some customers murmuring, others simply staring in stunned silence. "Let's go," one officer said flatly, guiding Frank toward the door. He twisted in their grip, shouting desperately, "You'll regret this! She's lying! All of you are blind!" But the voices of the diner rose louder, drowning him out. "We heard you," someone shouted. "We all heard you," another added. The sound built like a wave until Frank's protests vanished beneath it. Rachel pressed her trembling hand to her chest, a sob escaping before she could hold it back. For the first time in months, the weight pressing her down seemed to lift. Her knees wobbled, but she stood straighter, breathing deep as Frank was dragged outside. The bell over the door jingled one last time as it closed behind him, leaving only the echo of his anger fading into the street. Silence fell, heavy and full of release. Every eye turned toward Thomas. Rachel's lips parted, her voice a whisper, breaking the stillness. You're the owner?" Her voices were fragile, but her gaze held a glimmer of something new, hope fragile but alive. Thomas's eyes softened as he looked back at her, but his expression stayed firm. The hardest part was over. Justice had finally stepped through the door.
The diner seemed to breathe again once Frank was gone. The tension that had hung like smoke lifted slowly, replaced by murmurs and the faint clatter of cups being set back down on saucers. Thomas stood still in the center of it all, his presence filling the space with a quiet authority. He turned toward Rachel, whose eyes glistened with unshed tears. She clutched her bandaged wrist, unsure if she should step forward or disappear into the background. Thomas broke the silence first. His voice was steady, carrying to every corner of the room. "Rachel Carter," he said, and her head snapped up. "You've been carrying this place on your shoulders while being treated worse than anyone should ever be treated. That ends today." Rachel blinked, her breath catching. I don't understand." "You will," Thomas replied. He gestured toward the staff gathered near the kitchen, their faces a mixture of shock and relief. "From this day forward, you are no longer just a waitress. You'll be supervising this floor. You've earned it, not because of pity, not because of circumstance, but because you never gave up, even when the odds were stacked against you." For a heartbeat, the diner went silent again. Then applause erupted, first from a single pair of hands near the window, then spreading until the sound filled every corner. Rachel's face flushed, tears finally slipping free as she stood taller than she had in months. Her lips trembled, but she managed to whisper, "Thank you." Thomas gave a single nod, a faint smile tugging at the edges of his mouth. "You don't thank me," he said quietly. "You thank yourself. You had the courage to keep standing." Rachel pressed her free hand against her chest, her shoulders squaring, as if she carried herself differently now. Around her, the other staff drew closer, offering smiles, pats on the shoulder, nods of respect that had been absent before. Thomas turned once more to the room of customers, his gaze steady. "Let this be a reminder," he said firmly. "Cruelty and theft may hide in the dark for a while, but the truth has a way of finding its way into the light. Don't ever stay silent when you know what's right." The diner filled with quiet agreement, the lesson sinking in deeper than the coffee in their cups. And to you watching now, if you believe in courage, in justice, in standing tall even when the world tries to break you, share this story. Leave your thoughts below. And if you want more stories that remind us all what really matters, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Your voice is what keeps these stories alive.